On the 7th of March, 1945, while millions of prisoners in Nazi camps were being used for horrifying experiments, where thousands were dying each day behind electrified fences, a small group of American spies sat down with the men responsible. Nazi officers promised the surrender of 1 million troops, and all the Allies had to do was look the other way. Stalin called it treason because he didn't know any of this. This was Operation Sunrise, the day Western powers chose strategy over justice, and history never looked the same again. In February 1945, coded messages began passing between Allen Dulles in Switzerland and Allied headquarters. The OSS station in Bern had made contact with SS General Karl Wolff, who commanded German forces in Italy. Wolff hinted he might be willing to negotiate a surrender, but the situation was delicate. The Allies had agreed at Yalta not to make separate peace deals with Germany, yet here was a high-ranking Nazi offering to end the fighting in Italy months before the war's conclusion. Stalin immediately suspected a betrayal when he caught wind of the talks. He demanded Soviet representatives be present at any negotiations, threatening to derail the operation before it began. Meanwhile, Swiss intelligence officers, risking their country's neutrality, acted as intermediaries, facilitating secret meetings between Dulles and Wolff's emissaries in Zurich and Lugano. The stakes were enormous. If successful, thousands of lives could be saved by ending the Italian campaign early. If exposed, it could fracture the Allied alliance. The first face-to-face meeting took place in Lugano on the 3rd of March. Wolff arrived in civilian clothes, presenting himself not as a Nazi ideologue but as a practical military man. He agreed to release prominent Italian partisans from custody, a test of his sincerity. Dulles remained skeptical. Wolff's position was precarious. If Heinrich Himmler discovered these talks, Wolff would be executed for treason. Yet the SS general seemed convinced that Germany's defeat was inevitable and wanted to position himself favorably with the Allies. Dulles faced a difficult choice. Pushing forward with Wolff could prevent needless bloodshed in Italy, but it would infuriate Stalin. Abandoning the talks might preserve Allied unity but prolong the war. He decided to proceed, gambling that the potential gains outweighed the risks. By mid-March, Wolff had provided detailed military information, including the locations of German units and their readiness to surrender. The operation, now codenamed Sunrise, was in motion. Himmler's spies, however, were closing in. Rumors of Wolff's activities reached Berlin, forcing the SS general to tread carefully. Dulles, aware of the danger, instructed his team to maintain absolute secrecy. Despite Soviet protests and the looming threat of exposure, the negotiations gained momentum. Wolff had crossed a point of no return. He was now fully committed to the deal, even as the Gestapo grew suspicious. The question now wasn't just whether Wolff could deliver the surrender of German forces in Italy, but how far Dulles was willing to go to ensure the operation succeeded. Would he risk outright defiance of Soviet demands? Could he trust Wolff, a man who had served the Nazi regime for years, to hold up his end of the bargain? As the tension mounted, the stakes became clear. The fate of thousands hinged on a fragile web of clandestine agreements, any one of which could collapse at a moment's notice. On March 1945, in a discreetly guarded safe house, SS General Karl Wolff sat across from Allen Dulles, laying his cards on the table. Wolff wasn't just another Nazi functionary. As commander of German forces in northern Italy and western Austria, he controlled entire armies. His proposition was straightforward. He could orchestrate their surrender. But Allied intelligence knew something Wolff didn't. Himmler had already caught wind of his betrayal and sent Gestapo chief Ernst Kaltenbrunner to stop him. Wolff arrived armed with maps, prisoner release lists, and contingency plans. He told Dulles he could end combat operations against Italian partisans within days and free hundreds of Allied prisoners. Most critically, he claimed authority over the Brenner Pass, the vital Alpine route between Italy and Austria. If true, Wolff could prevent German forces from retreating into the mountains, where Hitler planned a last stand in the so-called Alpine Redoubt. Dulles faced an immediate dilemma. Soviet intelligence had intercepted Sunrise communications, triggering furious demands from Stalin for inclusion in the talks. Roosevelt and Churchill were under pressure to abandon the negotiations entirely to preserve Allied unity. Yet Wolfe's offer was too valuable to ignore. It could end the Italian campaign months early, sparing Rome from destruction and preventing thousands of battlefield deaths. The SS general's demeanor intrigued Dulles. Blunt yet calculating, Wolfe spoke like a pragmatic officer rather than a Nazi ideologue. When pressed about Himmler's suspicions, he admitted receiving orders to cease all contact with the Allies, orders he deliberately ignored. This act of defiance convinced Dulles Wolfe was serious, but it also exposed him to lethal danger. Any misstep could lead to his execution by the SS. On the 9th of March, Wolfe delivered proof of his commitment. He released Ferruccio Parri, leader of Italy's anti-fascist partisans, along with British intelligence operative Antonio Usmiani. Simultaneously, he diverted a trainload of Jewish prisoners from deportation to Auschwitz, rerouting them to Switzerland. These moves demonstrated his ability to override local Nazi leadership, a crucial test for the Allies. But Moscow's objections escalated into a crisis. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov accused the Americans of treachery, demanding all Sunrise negotiations include Red Army representatives. Washington nearly collapsed under the pressure, until Dulles leaked intelligence proving Stalin had made similar back-channel deals on the Eastern Front. The hypocrisy weakened Soviet protests, allowing talks to continue. By mid-March, Wolfe provided Dulles with German troop dispositions in Italy, including ammunition shortages and low morale. He even suggested drafting a surrender declaration for Field Marshal Kesselring to sign. Yet, as Dulles prepared final terms, Wolfe received a terse telegram from Kaltenbrunner: "Return to Berlin immediately." The Gestapo knew. Wolfe hesitated. Compliance meant abandoning Sunrise, but refusal marked him as a traitor. In a coded message, he told Dulles he would stay the course, gambling that Allied victory was inevitable. But the Gestapo was already surveilling his staff, and Himmler had ordered SS units in Italy to report directly to Berlin, bypassing Wolfe entirely. The operation now hung by a thread. If Wolfe lost control of his forces, any surrender would be meaningless. Dulles needed absolute proof Wolfe could still command loyalty from German troops. The answer would come not in Zurich, but on a blood-stained battlefield near Lake Garda. On the 11th of March, 1945, the Americans and British made a fateful decision. They informed the Soviets about Operation Sunrise. This single act nearly collapsed the entire operation. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov immediately accused the Western Allies of negotiating behind Stalin's back, calling it a betrayal of their alliance. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just days earlier, Wolfe had begun proving his sincerity by releasing prisoners, only for Soviet interference to threaten everything. Stalin demanded direct participation in the negotiations, insisting Soviet officers be present at all future meetings. The demand put Washington and London in an impossible position. If they refused, they risked shattering Allied unity. If they agreed, the talks might become so bogged down in Soviet obstruction that Wolfe's surrender plan would collapse. US Ambassador Averell Harriman pushed back hard, pointing out the hypocrisy. The Soviets had never allowed Western observers in their own secret negotiations on the Eastern Front. The British further complicated matters by waffling on their support. Some in London feared Stalin's reaction enough to suggest suspending Sunrise entirely. Dulles, operating from Switzerland, seethed at the interference. He argued that OSS operatives had built the delicate rapport with Wolfe over weeks. Bringing in Soviet officers now would spook the Germans and likely get Wolfe executed for treason. Every delay also increased the risk that Himmler's Gestapo would uncover the plot. President Roosevelt stepped in, writing a series of carefully worded letters to Stalin. He insisted Sunrise wasn't a separate peace deal, just a tactical surrender of German forces in Italy. Any surrender of enemy forces in the field, Roosevelt wrote, would have no political implications and wouldn't violate unconditional surrender terms. He promised the Soviets could participate in formal surrender ceremonies later, a concession meant to appease Stalin without derailing the ongoing talks. Molotov wasn't satisfied. He demanded an immediate halt to the Bern negotiations, accusing the Americans of duplicity. The Soviets had reason to distrust Allied motives. They suspected the West might cut a deal that left German forces free to fight on the Eastern Front. At the same time, Dulles received reports that Soviet intelligence was actively trying to penetrate the Sunrise operation, possibly to sabotage it. Roosevelt's diplomatic maneuvering bought just enough time. He clarified to Stalin that the talks only involved local German commanders, not high Nazi officials, and stressed that military surrenders wouldn't affect post-war agreements. This narrow framing temporarily calmed Soviet suspicions, but the damage was done. From that point forward, every move in Sunrise had to account for Soviet scrutiny. The Allies were no longer just negotiating with Wolf, they were navigating a political minefield where any misstep could trigger Stalin's fury. Meanwhile, Wolf faced his own crisis. Kaltenbrunner's Gestapo agents were circling, aware something was amiss. Orders from Berlin demanding his return went unanswered. Wolf knew his window was closing. If Sunrise failed now, he'd be left exposed as a traitor with no Allied protection. The same diplomatic storm that nearly sank the operation in the West was about to explode in his lap. And this time, the consequences wouldn't be political, they'd be lethal. On the 12th of March, 1945, a telegram arrived from Berlin that could have destroyed everything. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the SD, ordered SS General Karl Wolff to immediately cease all contact with the Allies in Switzerland. Kaltenbrunner suspected Wolff was negotiating behind Himmler's back and wanted to shut down the operation. This wasn't just bureaucratic interference, it was a direct threat. If Wolff obeyed, Sunrise would collapse. If he disobeyed, he'd be branded a traitor. Dulles acted fast. He instructed Baron Luigi Perilli, their Italian intermediary, to deliver a message: ignore Kaltenbrunner's demands. But Perilli was also warned Himmler and Kaltenbrunner might be using prisoner exchanges as a smokescreen for their own agenda. The stakes were clear. Wolff had to choose between loyalty to the collapsing Nazi regime or his secret pact with the Allies. Wolff made his decision. He called the Nazi plan for an Alpine redoubt, Hitler's last-stand fortress in the mountains' madness that would only bring untold and unnecessary suffering on the German people. This wasn't just criticism, it was outright defiance. By rejecting the redoubt strategy, Wolff was directly opposing Hitler's orders and Kaltenbrunner's authority. His defiance kept Sunrise alive, but it also marked him as a man with nothing left to lose. The next test came at Askana, near Locarno, where Wolff met with Dulles and Allied generals Lemnitzer and Airey. Here, Wolff laid out exactly what he controlled: 15,000 German troops, 20,000 Russian auxiliaries, 10,000 Serbs, another 10,000 Slovens, and a staggering 100,000 Italian soldiers under his command. He even detailed Hitler's recent decision to cancel evacuations from Italy, believing the front could still hold. This wasn't just talk. Wolff handed over a detailed map of German troop dispositions, proving he could deliver on his promises. General Airey noted Wolff's strong personality, active and intelligent, but also his crafty appearance and disillusionment with the war. Lemnitzer observed something more surprising. Wolff didn't bargain. He made no demands, offered no conditions. He simply outlined how surrender could work, even suggesting ways to bring Field Marshal Kesselring into the deal. This wasn't the behavior of a Nazi scheming for survival. It was the pragmatism of a man who knew the war was lost. Dulles recognized the need for cover. He proposed using prisoner exchanges as Wolff's official reason for traveling to Switzerland, a plausible explanation if the Gestapo asked questions. It was a calculated risk. Every meeting increased the chance of exposure, but Wolff's information was too valuable. His maps revealed weak points in German lines. His opposition to the Alpine redoubt confirmed Allied suspicions that the Nazis lacked the resources for a prolonged last stand. By mid-March, Wolff had committed treason twice over, first by negotiating with the enemy, then by ignoring direct orders from Berlin. His defiance gave Sunrise a fighting chance, but time was running out. Kaltenbrunner's agents were closing in, and Himmler had begun bypassing Wolff's chain of command. The operation now hinged on whether Wolff could maintain control of his forces long enough to enact the surrender, while evading Gestapo surveillance that could end with his execution. The gamble hinged on one brutal reality. If Sunrise succeeded, Wolff might survive the war as an Allied asset. If it failed, he wouldn't live long enough to face a Nuremberg trial. The irony was palpable. The same SS general who had helped enforce Nazi rule now stood as the best chance for ending the bloodshed in Italy, but only if he could outmaneuver his own regime. The war wasn't over yet. But for Karl Wolff, the real fight had just begun. As Wolff clung to command and Dulles navigated a web of deception, the fate of Sunrise still teetered on a knife's edge. What came next would reshape not just the war's end, but the intelligence architecture of the Cold War. If you've made it this far and want to keep uncovering the hidden deals and dangerous gambles that shaped our modern world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. On the 29th of April, 1945, German forces in Italy signed surrender documents in Caserta. Operation Sunrise had succeeded. The war in Italy ended 6 days before VE Day, saving countless lives. But for Allen Dulles, this wasn't the finish line. As others celebrated victory, he was already planning the next war. The real conflict, he believed, wouldn't be fought with tanks and infantry. It would be waged in shadows against Soviet communism. Dulles saw former Nazis not as criminals to be punished, but as assets to be used. SS General Karl Wolff, who helped broker the Italian surrender, became a valuable intelligence source. Otto Skorzeny, the infamous Nazi commando who rescued Mussolini, later worked with Western intelligence. These weren't isolated cases. Former SS officers, Gestapo agents, and Nazi scientists found new purpose in the Cold War. Their knowledge of Eastern Europe, Soviet tactics, and intelligence networks made them useful, regardless of their pasts. The OSS dissolved in October 1945, but its methods didn't disappear. Dulles helped shape the CIA's covert operations when he became its first civilian director in 1953. The same techniques pioneered during Sunrise, back-channel negotiations, secret alliances, and moral compromises became standard procedure. Intelligence agencies recruited former enemies while ignoring their wartime atrocities if they could help against the Soviets. Operation Gladio became one of the most disturbing outcomes. This clandestine NATO program created secret armies across Western Europe, stay-behind networks meant to resist Soviet invasion. Many recruits were former fascists and Nazis. In Italy alone, Gladio operatives allegedly numbered at least 10,000 trained fighters with hidden weapons caches. Similar networks operated in France, Belgium, and beyond. The program expanded throughout the Cold War, sometimes blurring the line between defense and subversion. Dulles set a dangerous precedent by prioritizing pragmatism over justice. Nazi war criminals escaped punishment if they had useful skills. Scientists who worked on V-2 rockets for Hitler were quietly brought to America through Operation Paperclip. Intelligence officers who oversaw executions became consultants on Soviet operations. This approach created a moral blind spot that would haunt Western intelligence for decades. The CIA's early structure reflected Sunrise's legacy. Covert action branches gained prominence over analysis departments. Field operatives received more funding than area experts. Dulles favored personal relationships over bureaucratic oversight, just as he had relied on his direct contact with Wolff rather than formal channels. This emphasis on clandestine deal-making shaped American intelligence culture during its formative years. By 1947, the rules had changed. The Truman Doctrine committed America to containing communism worldwide, and intelligence operations adapted accordingly. Sunrise's model, negotiating with morally compromised figures to achieve strategic gains, became a template. CIA officers in Berlin recruited former Abwehr agents. In Latin America, military dictators received support simply for being anti-communist. The long-term consequences were troubling. Former Nazis used Western protection to evade justice while shaping post-war political movements. Some Gladio operatives were later linked to far-right terrorism in Europe. Intelligence alliances built on expediency rather than principle often backfired. Allies became liabilities when their crimes became public. The ethical compromises made during the earliest days of the Cold War created patterns that proved difficult to break. Wolff's story exemplifies the contradictions. He avoided execution at Nuremberg by testifying against other Nazis, then worked quietly for Western intelligence. His case set the tone. If an SS general responsible for deporting Jews could be rehabilitated, what lines wouldn't be crossed? As the Iron Curtain descended, intelligence agencies on both sides recruited from history's darkest corners. The question wasn't about morality, but utility, a calculation first made during those tense Sunrise negotiations in Swiss safehouses. Operation Sunrise saved lives by ending the Italian campaign early, but it also demonstrated how quickly allies could become enemies, and enemies could become assets. Weaponizing former fascists against communism seemed like a smart strategy in 1945, but the costs would become apparent decades later. The Cold War's covert battles were already being fought before World War II officially ended. Dulles just saw them sooner than most. Karl Wolff walked free after the war, a fact that continues to trouble historians. As Himmler's top lieutenant, he had overseen the deportation of 300,000 Jews to Treblinka. Yet at Nuremberg, he served only 4 years. His cooperation with Operation Sunrise earned him leniency. The lingering question remains, was ending the war in Italy early worth letting a war criminal escape full justice? Otto Skorzeny's case was just as disturbing. The infamous SS commando who rescued Mussolini escaped execution thanks to a technicality. His commandos had worn American uniforms during combat, making their actions technically legal under the laws of war. Acquitted at Nuremberg, he was soon advising the CIA and West German intelligence. The man who once led Nazi death squads now trained Cold War agents. This pattern exposed a hard truth. Operation Sunrise wasn't just a tactical success, it became a model for post-war intelligence strategy. Nazis who proved useful were spared. Even Heinrich Himmler attempted the same trade, offering to surrender German forces in the West to keep fighting the Soviets. His plan failed. Wolff succeeded. The difference? Timing, and perhaps Wolff's calculated image as a pragmatic officer, not a fanatical ideologue. Alan Dulles defended these choices as necessary. Negotiating with Wolff, he argued, saved Allied lives and prevented further destruction. But the precedent was set. Strategic value trumped justice. This logic would guide Cold War operations for decades. Agencies like the CIA began recruiting former Gestapo officers, prioritizing their knowledge over their crimes. Perhaps the darkest legacy was Operation Gladio, NATO's secret stay-behind armies, often staffed by ex-fascists. Deals made during Sunrise laid the groundwork. What began as wartime expediency became standard policy. The cost? A world where justice was optional if you were useful enough. And Dulles, it seems, never looked back. Operation Sunrise secured the surrender of nearly 1 million German troops in Italy, saving countless lives. But SS General Karl Wolff, who helped orchestrate it and had overseen 300,000 Jews sent to Treblinka, walked free after 4 years. The Allies' pragmatism set a dangerous precedent. Similar deals followed, letting war criminals escape justice for Cold War gains. Was the expediency worth it? Or should justice have come first? Let us know below.